couple of years ago, I had the occasion to be in Atlanta, Georgia, to do a training. And while I was there, I visited a garden-style apartment complex in the northern suburbs of Atlanta. And it was, you know, a nice complex and a nice suburban community, and it was a gated community, and so it seemed very safe. But those gates were wide open. And there were cameras mounted on poles and all sorts of things that would give you a feeling of security. But I walked right onto that property. I really didn't have any business being there. Now these were garden-style apartments, and so they were sort of set into a hill. So as you walked in to on the first floor and walked towards the back, that back area was sort of underground. And that's where the laundry room was. And on the door jamb to the laundry room, there was an electronic lock where you needed a swipe card to get in. But the door to the laundry room was wide open. And off of the laundry room, there was a metal door with no doorknob, just a deadbolt lock. And that door was open as well. And it led to an area that was probably maybe about 1.5 times the size of this area here. And it was almost like an unfinished basement. And it was strewn with some stray trash and debris. And as I looked around, I couldn't help but recognize all of those incidents of inadequate security that I talk about in my job every day. And I was there in that laundry room because that's where my sister Paulette was murdered in 1982. She was the victim of a serial killer. And he had been living or squatting in that unfinished area off the laundry room. And he came to go to sleep one night, and she was doing her laundry. And he beat her and strangled her, and after she was dead, he carved the date into her, sexually desecrated her, and left her lying on the floor. She was 23 years old and engaged to be married. And as I looked around at that apartment complex, I was haunted by the thought of all of the other women who were injured or put at risk because that apartment complex was never held accountable. The day I stood there, it had been 19 years since Paulette had been killed, and nothing had changed. Because you know, back in 1982, the victims' rights movement was just beginning. It was the year of President Reagan's Crime Victims' Rights Task Force, and the year of the founding of Parents of Murdered Children, and most of your jobs didn't exist. There were no advocates in the police department or the prosecutor's office to tell our family what our rights were. And now I was a rather precocious child. I was 14 years old when Paulette was murdered. And within 6 weeks, I wrote to the chief of police in Atlanta asking for copies of the police reports, and he wouldn't give them to me. It was 2 years later when the police told us that Paulette's killer had confessed. And it was Otis Toole, who also murdered Adam Walsh. And at that point I was 16, and I was smart enough to know that I needed a lawyer. And I had a Boy Scout leader who was a lawyer, and I had him call the police for me. And he talked to the police, and he called me back, and he said, you know, Jeff, he's confessed. There's not going to be a trial, but he's never going to get out of jail. He's killed far too many people. And I thought, okay, fine. And I went on with my life to find something else to do to honor her memory. And it's part of the whole reason that I became an attorney. And when I was working as a law clerk in 1995, I read in the newspaper about National Crime Victims' Rights Week, and learned that the police department in my community had a support group for homicide survivors. And I went to that support group, and when I got there, this was in 1995, it had been 13 years since Paulette had been killed, but that was the very first time that I ever met another person who had lost a loved one to homicide. And I went to that meeting thinking, well, I'm a lawyer, I can help these people, right? But they ended up helping me far more than I could help them. But every time someone new would come, we'd go around the table and everyone would tell their story. When they tell their story, they'd also talk about the grievances that they had with the criminal justice system. And as a lawyer, sometimes I could tell them why things were the way they were, but other times I couldn't come up with a good reason. And so I said, why don't we change the law? And we did it 13 times, making sure that victims had the right to make an oral impact statement, that they had the right to confer with prosecutors about potential plea agreements, that we expanded the definition of victim to include siblings and other people, and did this work. And then finally, John Walsh was coming for Crime Victims' Rights Week one year. And I had read how Otis Toole had a friend or lover or partner by the name of Henry Lee Lucas, who was a very famous serial killer. There was a movie about him called Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. And he confessed to hundreds of killings. And later we found out that the Texas Rangers were just feeding him information and closing all their cold cases. And so I was worried that they might be doing that with Otis Toole, and so I had written to John Walsh ahead of time and explained my situation and said, do you really think that Toole killed Adam? Do you think they're closing cases on his confessions? And when I met John Walsh, he knew exactly who I was, and he said, yes, I'm convinced that Toole killed Adam, but you know, he's dying of AIDS in prison, and you need to write to the parole board, because he could get like a hospice type clemency. And so being a good lawyer, I was going to write to the parole board, and I wanted to cite the sentencing order. And that's when I learned there was no sentencing order, because he'd never even been charged in my sister's death. The police closed the case, but the prosecutor felt, well, he's already been convicted, so what's the point of charging him with this crime too? And so not one day that he spent in prison was for what he did to my sister. And we didn't even have any standing as victims to write to the parole board because he wasn't even charged in our case. And that's when I knew I had to dedicate all my time to working for victims' rights. And that's when I went to go join the National Center for Victims of Crime. And I will travel around the country and talk until I'm blue in the face, because I have dedicated my career to the proposition that victims of crime must be afforded a full measure of justice in both the civil and criminal systems. But I can't do it alone, and that's why I need your help. Because you're the folks who work with victims every day, and you're the ones who can give me the information our family never had. I honestly believe that we can make places safer, and there are people whose crimes we will prevent by making people focus on safety and security. You know, everything I've done as a victim advocate boils down to two simple things. I've offered my hand for guidance and support to other victims as they walk this path, and I have offered my voice on behalf of those who have been silenced, whether they've been silenced by homicide, or grief, or shame, or fear, or isolation. I need you to add your voice to that chorus, and we can give victims the information they need so they can be empowered to make a difference, not only for themselves, but for other people as well. I wouldn't be standing here today if it wasn't for victim advocates in my community. I'm so grateful for the work that you do, and I'm so proud to be associated with all of you. You folks have been a terrific audience. I hope this is just the beginning of us working together. So take this information, share it with victims, and please keep up the good work. Thank you so much.